So with aerial photography, we're assuming there's some sort of camera mounted on an aerial device, and that camera has a lens. So let's talk a little bit about the lens geometry. As we can see in this figure, the lens is curved on both sides. And so what this means is that as light passes through the lens, if it goes through the curved portion, it's going to be refracted or bent as it enters the glass from air to glass, and then again coming out of the glass to the air. And it's going to take a different path after it comes out. So this light coming in is going to be bent, with the exception of one ray that comes right down the middle called the chief ray, which goes right down the optical axis through the nodal point at the center of the lens, and then continues on straight to this one point here where all of these rays are coming together. All of these bent refracted rays and the chief ray are all coming together, and that's going to be the focal point. And we can imagine if our focal plane was further back, we'd have to move it up here in order to get everything focused on the focal point. And if our focal plane were further up here, we would have to move it in this direction here to have all of the light focused on that focal point. Our focal length is that one unique length where all the light coming through this lens is going to be focused at one particular point. And one thing we do have to consider here is that different light is going to be refracted at different focal lengths. And so, for example, the blue wavelengths here are going to be refracted at a shorter focal length, and the infrared, the red wavelengths are longer than the blue and the green, and the infrared would be the longest of all. So cameras have to account for this adjustments in the focal lengths if they want to account for all the different portions of the electromagnetic spectrum. In addition to the focal length, other considerations are the f-stop and brightness. So the f-stop is how wide the aperture of the lens is open. So this little opening here would represent the portion of that that's allowing the light to come through. If we flip back a couple of slides, that would be that portion between these two black lines here. This would be an aperture stop that's not allowing the light to come through, and then the aperture would be this area in between. So these field stops we typically shorten and call those f-stops. Here are the f-stop numbers here. If you've taken photography, you might be familiar with some of these. And this is the size of the aperture. So the size of the aperture is decreasing as the f-stop number is going up. And each time we take one of these steps here, it's decreasing the relative brightness, the amount of intensity of the light that we would have on the film or on the digital matrix behind there by about 50%. So going from an f2 to an f2.8, that would be 50% less bright. Going from an f2.8 to an f4 would be 50% less bright again. So we can adjust the f-stop depending on how much brightness we want to expose the film or the digital matrix to. And if we think about this, so we have this sort of geometry with aerial photographs. We have this area of the ground that we'd like to photograph. We have one point in the center of that ground, and that's where the chief ray would come up from. So the chief ray would come here, it would go through the center of the lens, and then it would go to something called the photographic nadir. And the photographic nadir in this case would line up with the ground nadir along this one line, this one unbent line that's going right through the center of this lens. And the rest of the picture would be going through this lens, and it would be somewhat distorted. This is going to be the one point in the picture where there's no distortion. And as we'll see in the next series, we call that the principal point.